Breaking tonight, President Trump on offense about reports that he told his Deputy Attorney General Rod Rosenstein what to say in a crucial memo that played a role in the firing of James Comey. Sources telling Fox News that President Trump asked Rosenstein to make it clear in the memo that he was not under investigation in the Russia probe. The president hit back at that today, tweeting that Russia had nothing to do with the Comey firing. Fired FBI Director Andrew McCabe reportedly wrote a memo about all of this as it was happening, and now that memo is in the hands of Robert Mueller. Here now, Jonathan Turley, George Washington University law professor, to react to that and some other news today. Jonathan, good to see you this evening.
Martha.
So what is the significance of the McCabe memo that he wrote and turned over, according to this?
Well, it's hard to say. I think ultimately it may say more about McCabe's mindset than the president's. The president was perfectly clear. He told everyone from the FBI director to his barber that he wanted it to be made public that he was not a target or subject of the investigation. He's been very consistent about that. All the witnesses have said that. And so it's not too surprising that he suggested the same mantra. Now, it might be an obsession, to be sure, but it's not a cover story, at least for people looking at it objectively. If McCabe wrote the memo because he felt the president was trying to create a cover story, it really does raise this question of how McCabe viewed the president and his motivations. So the memo may say a lot about both men.
So in terms of, here's one of the tweets that the president put out today. Not that it matters, but I never fired James Comey because of Russia. The corrupt mainstream media keeps loving to push that narrative, but they know it's not true. Now, what everybody took off on today was this soundbite that everyone remembers from NBC back in 2017.
And in fact, when I decided to just do it, I said to myself, I said, you know, this Russia thing with Trump and Russia is a made-up story. It's an excuse by the Democrats for having lost an election.
So, Jonathan Turley, I mean, you know, the question is, if that was what was in his mind, that he wanted Rosenstein to say that he was not under investigation. We know that was, you know, stuck in his craw, that he wanted Mueller, Comey rather, to say that as well. Is there anything illegal about that, or is that obstruction in any way in and of itself?
Well, I think 2 points should be made. First of all, obviously, this was self-immolation. I don't understand why the president would say that. But in fairness to him, he went on in the same interview and he said, I understand by firing Comey, I am likely to prolong this investigation. He also indicated that he understood the investigation had to run its course. Comey himself said that the president agreed with him that the investigation should run its course. And so the record is not quite as clear as people make out to be. But in terms of obstruction, I think that there is no credible evidence based on the Comey firing to make out a criminal charge. There were plenty of reasons for Trump to fire Comey. The Rosenstein letter revealed what everyone already knows, and that is that Republicans and Democrats alike, former justice officials, felt that he should be fired. Now, he had a perfectly valid reason to do so. The statement obviously has cost him a great deal, but I don't think it makes out a case for obstruction.
Yeah, I mean, it really all depends in the end. We're all waiting for this report from Robert Mueller and how he interprets it. But according to these stories, you know, there's a breathless story every single day, basically, that pushes forward this narrative and tries to get into the mind of Robert Mueller about how he's interpreting all of this. But the bottom line is, Jonathan, that we really don't know how he's interpreting all of this.
I think that's absolutely right. I can tell you that from a criminal defense standpoint, people are fooling themselves when they believe that the Comey firing alone would be the basis of an obstruction case. Moreover, the president has a good basis to argue even his problems with Sessions did not amount to obstruction. I think he's wrong about Sessions. I think Sessions took the right step. I think that was the ethical course to take. But the president can say that he felt that the FBI was hostile territory and that when he came into office and found out the FBI was investigating him, he wanted to have one of his own people at the top of that investigation. Now that doesn't make for obstruction. It may be bad judgment on his part, but it falls short of the criminal code.
Jonathan, always good to see you. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Martha.